Awesome. Thank you so much. Hey, everyone. My name is Jeff Bly. I'm a senior product manager on the Microsoft Identity and Network Access team, here to talk about securing cross-tenant collaboration. So a little bit of the agenda. We'll be going over sort of an overview of, what is this B2B collaboration thing that we'll be discussing today. We'll go over into some of the history of the legacy security controls and how they evolved into the modern security controls. And we'll leave you with some go-dos to better secure your environment. So starting with the overview, here's a few key phrases and terminology that I'll be using throughout this presentation, and I just want to briefly go over this so that we're all speaking the same language. When I say home tenant, that means it is the tenant where an identity is originally provisioned to, and that is where they're managed. So think of a standard employee identity. You're provisioned into the Entra ID tenant. That is its home tenant. Whereas the resource tenant would be some external organization is inviting your identity into that tenant. That's where the resources lived. And so think of it as the inviting tenant versus the invited tenant. And likewise, inbound access, that has to do with me protecting my resources. So if I have some inbound controls, then I'm inviting people externally in. And if I want to control outbound access, that is me putting controls of my users and where they can go and what they can do in external resource tenants. So before B2B came to be, there were a couple of traditional collaboration models which organizations would leverage in order to collaborate with users and people who are not part of their organization. The first approach was federation, and that involved your organization essentially setting up a federation with every individual partner. This had a lot of overhead, a lot of drawbacks. From a security perspective, it was difficult to have any kind of user application level visibility. You didn't know necessarily the environment that you were federating to, as far as like how secure it is. It was expensive in terms of I have to manage every single federation. If I have 1,000 partners, that's 1,000 federations, 1,000 certificates that I have to monitor and make sure that they're rolled over. And especially if I'm collaborating with a smaller partner that doesn't necessarily have a official identity provider, maybe they're just using a consumer email and that's it, then federation wasn't even an option. Or even if they did have it, being a smaller organization, they might not have the expertise to be able to manage that. And of course, all of this increases the complexity of the environment of exponentially having to increase these federations. Now, the second approach was a little bit simpler, but also had its drawbacks, and that was managing the partner identities. And what this means is I have, let's say, a partner who wants to collaborate with me, and so I'm going to give him a username and password from my own organization. And maybe I might designate it, I might put like a V dash in front of it, and go from there. But the problem with that primarily is the fact that it is not tied to any sort of HR system or home identity. It is independent of anything that has to do with the relationship between the two organizations, meaning that if this user quits or is fired from his home organization, there is not any process, at least by default, there's not any process to automatically revoke this other identity that you have provisioned for them to access your resources. And of course, there's the additional expense of the onboarding process, having to manage password or MFA resets. And of course, the complexity for the partner is not great. Maybe if he's collaborating with 10 organizations, does that mean he needs 10 more usernames and passwords? So it's not a great user experience. And just some visuals for sort of the traditional collaboration models which we've discussed. If I create another identity, again, user B in the Fabricam tenant on the right is independent of user B in the Contoso tenant. They are not connected in any way, and so when the user leaves Fabricam, you still have this residual or persistent access in Contoso. And likewise, this is another model I didn't mention before, but the copying data of I'm just going to send an offline attachment in an email. Well, if you do that, the organization can easily lose control of that data. So Entra ID B2B collaboration, where it's an invitation model where we invite a external user. This user account in the resource directory, in the inviting directory, for all intents and purposes, as far as authorization goes, it is just like any other account. You have full control over the authorization policies and what this user can and cannot do in your tenant. But from an authentication perspective, it always is a redirect to the identity in the home tenant. So this is directly linked to this home identity. And what that means is that when it leaves, if the guest object that remains in the resource tenant tries to access something, well, you know, every hour I need a new access token, for example, and when I go to authenticate again, I will suddenly discover that the home identity can no longer authenticate, so I can't get a token, and now all of my access is revoked as well in the resource tenant. And so it's sort of secure by default simply by tying the guest identity to the home identity. So these are the various invitation redemption flows that are supported today. If the partner that you're collaborating with has Entra ID, wonderful. You invite them, they'll authenticate with that credential and everything just works out of the box. If they use a different identity provider, we still support the traditional SAML and WS Federation approach. But if you don't want to set this up, we also support email one-time passcode. So as long as they have a corporate email, there is no federation or any other additional configuration you need to set up. We'll just authenticate them with that email essentially. And if they have no IT, we obviously still support the email one-time passcodes, but we also support consumer identities such as Google, Facebook, and of course, Microsoft accounts. If you are collaborating with organizations within or across different Microsoft clouds, B2B does support cross-cloud invitation essentially. You will note it only goes back and forth between Azure Commercial and China and Azure Commercial and Azure Government. And I will highlight that this is not enabled by default. There are reasons for the separation of these clouds, and so we don't want to, you know, blur the lines, these security boundaries for no reason. So in order for this to work, it does require essentially a two-way handshake of both organizations have to check the box for the other cloud, and then they both need to enter the tenant ID of the partner that they want to collaborate with. Now, B2B collaboration does not work in every scenario, and I've had the opportunity to interview many customers trying to identify, you know, what's stopping you from using B2B collaboration? Why are you maybe stuck on either the federation or the managed identity model, which is more in the legacy sphere? And there are still some use cases where a managed identity for an external partner might be required. The first is legacy applications, and LDAP is the biggest culprit here. If you have applications that are requiring LDAP binds, that requires a password be present in the resource tenant. And as I mentioned earlier, B2B does not have a password local to the resource tenant. It is always a redirect. The second is device management. If I have to have, let's say I'm a highly regulated, I'm in a highly regulated industry, let's say I'm a bank, for example, and I need to have some sort of device compliance or some sort of insight to making sure that the device that is accessing it is secure. This usually means either I have to issue a physical device or more commonly issue a virtual desktop. And today, Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop do not support yet the ability for a B2B user to unlock that device. It has to be a local account with the local credential. And then third was the local mailbox scenario. Again, let's say back to the bank scenario. If I'm onboarding a partner to help with as a support desk, let's say, and now I have this vendor communicating with my customers, that communication should be coming from an inbox that is managed by me. I don't want, from a consumer perspective, it'd be very strange if I think I'm talking to my bank, but I see a Outlook.com or Gmail.com email in these communications. That would be a red flag for me personally. And so because Exchange does not yet support any kind of inboxes for B2B guests, this again falls into the scenario where I need to create a local account in order to provision a mailbox. But if you're not in one of these three categories, or if you're not in some door number 4 category, which prevents you from adopting B2B and moving off of the traditional collaboration models, then B2B is the way for you. But the invitation is actually open by default in terms of unless you've taken additional steps to lock it down, anybody can invite anybody else. And so now you have this proliferation of access potentially happening within your environment. And so that is going to be the topic for the rest of this session, is how can you control the access between various organizations and their tenants. So the very first control that was released was tenant restrictions, and I'm now appending it with tenant restrictions v1 because, as you've probably guessed by now, later on there was a v2 released. So let's dive in. So tenant restrictions v1, this is what it looked like, and what it still looks like today for many organizations. Essentially, what you have to do is hairpin all of your traffic, or at least all of the authentication traffic, to a corporate network. So people on the network are coming in and egressing via my corporate firewall, and those who are external to the network are being tunneled in, perhaps through a VPN. At this network interface, I'm going to do some sort of TLS inspection or break and inspect. And in the middle of that, I'm going to inject a header. And the header is basically going to say, these are the tenant IDs or destinations that are allowed from this network. And then comma separating all of the tenant IDs, et cetera, that you want to have on the allow list. So then you re-encrypt it, you send it off to Entra ID, and then when it arrives at Entra ID, we'll crack open the header and say, all right, is this traffic bound for a tenant that is not on the list? And if it is not on the list, then we will deny access. And here's an example of what that looks like. You'd see, your network administrator has restricted what organizations can be accessed. So this the tenant restrictions policy only applies to traffic that is being hairpinned through your corporate network. And the implications of that is that it is sort of a very wrecking ball approach, and all or nothing for, is this access allowed to this tenant, yes or no? There is no sort of granularity in terms of what applications are allowed, or even sort of what specific users are or are not allowed. By default, if I allow tenant A, it's open for anybody. Any kind of identity, personal or unmanaged or external identity, can access tenant A, in addition to what I'm actually trying to authorize, which is just my own users trying to access tenant A. So along came Cross Tenant Access Settings, and this is our first modern Cross Tenant Access control. And it introduced a lot more granularity. You can target specific applications and on a per user, per group basis, both inbound and outbound. And so today we're focusing specifically on the outbound access. You can even trust MFA or device signals from external partners to satisfy your conditional access policies. But the problem was that tenant restrictions v1 was not aware of this additional policy. So these were sort of two policies that were in series rather than side by side. So let's say my goal is as is listed here. Only the sales group can access the sales app in tenant A, and any user can access tenant B, but only the Office 365 apps. And that is what I'm trying to achieve. And I want to block access to everything else. Well, when I layer this on top of tenant restrictions v1, I have to still allow tenant A and B in the tier v1 policy. And then for my internal employees, their identities, they will be allowed. I will then have the more granular or more restrictive policy applied on top of that. So you can see tenant A and tenant B, I have an L for limited access. But for all of the external identities, these are personal accounts or identities that maybe these tenants have issued to my employees, they only get the TRV1 policy, and so they get full access to tenant A and B. And so again, this is not particularly great. Now, tenant restrictions v2 is introduced, and rather than being in series, tenant restrictions v2 is essentially cross tenant access aware. It's been enlightened, and it says, all right, we have this wonderful granular policy for my own employees. I'm going to let that be managed by that policy. And this extra tenant restrictions v2 policy will only apply to the unmanaged identities, the external identities, or the personal accounts. So now I can be very granular for all identity types. I can allow my users only the access they need to ensure the principle of least privilege. And I can even apply that principle of least privilege to the external users. Like, for example, Bob here needs access to his tenant with his identity to access his mailbox. So maybe we'll allow that through with the tenant restrictions v2 policy, but I'll block everything else. So that is the difference in terms of what's in the policy between tenant restrictions v1 and v2. Now, I pulled this from our documentation, and if you want to read this, feel free. Just do a search engine for tenant restrictions v2, and you can see tenant restrictions v2 has a lot more text, a lot more capabilities, but I'm going to go ahead and summarize this for you. The big differences and the advantages that v2 has over v1 is the introduction of per user group and app targeting. The fact that the policy is managed via the portal. This is one maybe a detail I didn't fully go into, but in the tier v1, I'm stuffing the entire policy in the header. And there are only so many characters I can fit into a network header. So you might hit that limit after only a couple hundred or even fewer partner organizations. It all just depends on what your proxy solution supports and what is allowed. Whereas tenant restrictions v2, the header is tenant ID, policy ID. So that's it. As changes need to occur through the policy, I don't need to make the change at every one of my network proxies. I just go to the portal and update it there because the same header is injected no matter what. And when it arrives at Entra ID, we'll essentially do a just-in-time lookup of what is in this policy. So there's no size limitations with TRV2. And there are some additional data plane protections available in tenant restrictions v2 as well. This is in public preview. It also allows you to block the anonymous links. Speaking of this, there is something called universal tenant restrictions, which I'd like to highlight here. So with both tenant restrictions v1 and v2, I could do the header injection by hairpinning the traffic through my own corporate proxy. But that has some performance implications for the users. If throughout the world, you kind of have to tunnel it all to your corporate network, which may or may not be physically close to where the users are. And it also means that's additional work and network equipment that your team has to manage and maintain. And if you're doing this TLS inspection just for the header injection, you might be doing it for other things, but if you are doing it just for this tenant restrictions header injection, it's a bit overkill. especially compared to what's available now. Microsoft recently released, or not too recently, it was actually July of 2024, our Security Service Edge solution, which is also known as Global Secure Access. And essentially what you can do is, well, there's one of two models. You can either deploy an agent to your devices, and today we have support for clients for Windows, Android, iOS, and Mac. And I will also point out that for Android and iOS, the mobile devices, this agent is actually built into the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint application. So that's actually one less agent you need to deploy if you're already using Defender for Endpoint. But anyway, you deploy this client to the devices, you enable the Microsoft traffic forwarding profile, and now the Microsoft traffic is going to be securely tunneled to the nearest point of presence to the user. And this is a globally distributed service, so the users will get a low latency connection wherever they are in the world. And in many cases, the points of presence are actually co-located with the same front doors that the Microsoft traffic would be bound to anyway, so fewer hops, better performance, you get the idea. The second model is that I could actually configure my company networks. So think if I have an actual corporate office or branch offices, for each one of those, I can set up a site-to-site VPN via the border gateway protocol. It will discover the destinations for the Microsoft tunnel and will securely tunnel that traffic to us as well. Now, the beauty of all of this is because we're already securely tunneling the traffic, we can do the header injection for you. And all of this is included in P1 licensing. So as long as you have P1, you can do all of this at no additional cost. Now, if you are already using, let's say, a third-party SSE provider, Zscaler and Netscope are two of the most popular providers out there, excluding Global Secure Access, of course. We do support side-by-side coexistence deployments, meaning you could, let's say, deploy a third-party client and the Global Secure Access client on the same device and configure them in such a way that the GSA client would handle all of the Microsoft traffic and the third-party client can handle everything else. Now, we also support tunneling private access and internet access traffic as well. So if you want to do a full rip and replacement and just use GSA for everything, that is also supported. But I wanted to highlight the fact that you do not have to replace your third-party network solution if you don't want to. So just a couple of bullet points in terms of the advantages over, it's called Internet Access for Microsoft Services. That is the subset of capabilities that is available within the GSA feature set to P1 customers. And these are the main bullet points as to the advantages. Best-in-class SASE for Office 365 network performance. Again, fewer hops. If you have to go to an additional data center and then to our data center, that's obviously going to be a little bit slower. Universal tenant restrictions eliminates the need to hairpin the traffic through your own network. You can enforce a compliant network check, not only on the Microsoft applications, but on any enterprise app that you have integrated with Entra ID. And this ensures that when I make authentication requests and get my tokens, that those requests have to be done through Global Secure Access. And if someone were to, let's say, steal an exfiltrate or refresh token to a device outside of my organization, that would fail. So it sort of can play a part in your token replay strategy to reduce the impact of successful token theft. Not 100%, but certainly an additional layer of protection. Universal continuous access evaluation extends near real-time revocation to any additional Microsoft services. Now, this is a really exciting capability that, let's say, if you're gating internet access or private access through Global Secure Access, I can now essentially revoke and collapse the tunnel in near real time as if it was a native application that had integrated with the continuous access evaluation protocol. I could do an entire session just on CAE, but essentially this eliminates the need for code changes on the app and the client side to get this type of near real-time revocation. And for the even if you just did it for the Microsoft services, not every Microsoft app has integrated with CAE. And so anything that you can tunnel with GSA now has this capability. And of course, let's not forget source IP restoration, because we are sort of blending the network and the identity layers together. What normally happens, and let's say in the TRV1 traditional deployment scenario, if I'm hairpinning all of my traffic to my corporate network, and then it goes from my network out to Entra ID, when you look at the sign-in logs, all of the locations will be the same. It'll show your network. It's not going to show where the users are actually authenticating from. And this has some security implications, especially if you're trying to do any kind of investigation. It's an important bit of information to know where the attack might have actually started from. So with Global Secure Access, we preserve the original IP address of the user. And so when you look in the sign-in logs, you'll see two IP addresses, one of the Global Secure Access proxy service, essentially, and the original IP address of the user. So you preserve this information. This is great for investigations. It's also really good for risk-based detections. So if you're using identity protection, which is the heuristics-based or type analytics, where machine learning will verify that this is the baseline for Jeff. Let's say, Jeff, it's normal for me to sign in from North Carolina. That's where I'm based. But now we see he's signing in from South Africa. That's a little bit unusual. That's a bit of an anomaly. Maybe we want to trigger some step-up multi-factor authentication for that specific sign-in event. But when all of the traffic is being proxied, you sort of lose some of that fidelity. And so with source IP restoration, we maintain that fidelity of your risk-based detections, and everyone's life is easier. Now, I wanted to show you just how easy this was to deploy universal tenant restrictions. You deploy the client, which, let's say if you're doing a proof of concept, you'd simply go to the portal and download the exe file, run it on your device, and it's installed. Done. Obviously, in a production environment, you could push this out via the MDM of your choice. And in our documentation, we show how you can do this with Intune. But apart from deploying the client, all you have to do is enable the Microsoft traffic profile and enable universal tenant restrictions, and you're done. Now, whatever policy you have configured in Tenant Restrictions v2 will now be applied to all of the traffic being tunneled via GSA. So that is everything in a nutshell. So these last couple slides, I just wanted to give you some friendly advice. Now, step number one, you want to identify what is actually occurring in your environment. What does that normal baseline look like for you? So there's one of two ways to do this. If you're sending the sign-in logs to a log analytics workspace, you can simply go to the Entra portal, and there is an out-of-the-box workbook called Cross Tenant Access Activity Workbook. Simply look at the report, and it'll show you exactly what users are accessing which external tenants. And if you wanted to leverage that as the baseline, lock that down and say, all of this is allowed, but nothing new will be allowed unless they go through this additional process, which I will set up for onboarding new tenants. But if you're not using the log analytics workbooks, there is also a PowerShell module which you can run. Just do a search for git-msidc or MSID Cross Tenant Access Activity, and you'll be able to essentially query your own sign-in logs and get the same kinds of insights. Now, once you have that understanding, go ahead and configure the Cross Tenant Access settings to restrict the inbound and outbound access to whatever your organization wants it to be. Most of the time, it is a allow list type configuration, where in the default settings, I say block everything, and then I will add specific organizations that will say these are allowed and for these users and these applications. If you're still using Tenant Restrictions V1, please migrate to V2. Even if you're not going to adopt universal tenant restrictions and you still want to hairpin the traffic, that is your choice. But TRV2 has some major advantages. If you want some guidance of how to migrate from V1 to V2, you can go to aka.ms/TRV2 migration, and it provides some prescriptive guidance of how to make that migration. And finally, once you are on Tenant Restrictions V2, that is the prerequisite for universal tenant restrictions, go ahead and try Global Secure Access. Do a proof of concept, install an agent on one device, and see the magic work. See the header injection is automatically done for you. Try to access some external tenants, you'll get the nice error message. And then if it meets your requirements, you can then continue to roll that out more broadly to your organization's devices. And with that, I will say thank you so much for your time. I hope this has provided you with some useful information, and I wish you all the best on all of your zero trust journeys. Thanks, and have a good day. Jamie, do I hand this back over to you?
I wanted to know if, Frank, did we have any questions that came in?
Yeah, some kind of question that maybe we can try to answer now. By the way, a very nice presentation, Jeff. Very, very, very clever. Everything you show up, because we discussed a lot of things. We discussed cross tenant access. We discussed tenant restriction V2, global secure access. Everything is under which licenses, basically. So this was one of the question we had.
Gotcha. Everything I've mentioned today is P1. The only thing that would require additional licensing that I might have talked about, the risk-based detections, like sign-up risk and user risk, that requires P2. And if you wanted to leverage the global secure access clients, let's say as a VPN replacement, that would require private access. That's a new SKU. And if you wanted to protect all of the internet traffic, then Microsoft Entra Internet Access, that's a new SKU as well, and that's our secure web gateway solution.
Thank you. So all the cross tenant access policies, tenant restriction is part of P1 and protects Microsoft services in a nutshell. Thank you very much. Okay, the second one, you mentioned that, or the idea is that for user connecting to a resource tenant, they may have to do MFA. And you mentioned something about the fact that we can trust that status, right? Can you elaborate a little bit more on that and what kind of sensor we can trust? Cross tenant, cross tenant.
Sure. So within cross tenant access settings, there are essentially two groups of policies. There's the default policy, which is, as the name implies, this is what happens by default. But if I wanted to target a specific tenant, I can add them as an organizational policy, and that would, for users in that tenant, would override the defaults. In both, there is a tab called Trust Settings. So I could do this either for everyone by default or on a per organization basis, but I can check the box that says for this organization, trust MFA and or trust hybrid join devices and or trust compliant devices. And what that does is that when I have a conditional access policy that requires MFA or a hybrid or compliant join device, rather than evaluate that within the resource tenant context, it's going to result in another redirect back to the home tenant. So if I have a compliant device in my own organization, that can be used to satisfy a conditional access policy in a resource tenant. Now, most organizations that I've spoken with don't necessarily feel comfortable with the device trust unless there is some sort of relationship between the two organizations. So think like a multi-tenant organization. I'm Microsoft, but we also own LinkedIn, for example. From a security perspective, that would make sense that, hey, we have some visibility into what does a compliant device mean for your organization, and I can say that's good enough for my conditional access policies. What is far more common is the trusting MFA, which is essentially enabling bring your own MFA. So if I've got MFA in my own tenant, let's say it could be a passkey, it could be authenticator app, whatever, then I can simply trigger that. I do MFA in the home tenant context, and when the claim is returned to the resource tenant, that will satisfy the resource tenant's conditional access policies. Whereas if you do not trust MFA, but you require MFA on the external users, what that means is that the users will be prompted to set up and register for MFA in the resource tenant. So if it's the authenticator app, you know, I might have multiple registrations with different rolling codes, et cetera, for every tenant that I'm invited to. So pretty common, and I'd say I'd recommend in general that trusting MFA is a nice balance between it allows me to have the security of MFA without necessarily giving the users a poor user experience of having to register again. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have another one in the chat about B2B with UPN and email mismatch, and the thing there is, yeah, I guess you already get where the question is going, and can you tell something with that, because I guess the Microsoft recommendation is still to align UPN and email, and it's one of the reasons why, but yeah.
Yes, so I'll explain the problem before I explain the solution. The problem arises when I have a UPN value, we'll say Jeff UPN at Microsoft.com, and I have a different string as my email, Jeff email at Microsoft.com. And when someone, let's say, invites me or shares a document with me, they might not see my UPN, they'll only see the email. So they invite the email. Now I try to redeem the invitation by clicking the link, and it says sign in. And so I enter my email, it results in a redirect, but then it says user not found or user cannot sign in. And that is because at the sign in page, we're only looking for UPNs. By default, that's the only string, in fact, that you could enter for us to do a lookup and identify who is actually trying to sign in. And so when the UPNs and emails are mismatched, that problem can arise. So solution number one, and this is the best, don't do the mismatch. Make the UPNs and the emails the same, and everything will work out smoothly. The second workaround is invite the UPN or share the document with the UPN, not the email. That will allow the user to successfully sign in and access whatever has been shared. There is a third option, which can only be done by the home tenant. So you as the inviting tenant actually don't have control over this. But if you have a relationship with the organization that you're trying to invite, you could go ask them to flip this switch on. And that is email as alternate sign-in. It is in public preview, and I'm not sure what the timeline is for it going generally available. But essentially what it allows you to do is when a user enters their username, Entra ID now knows, okay, look for this string amongst the UPNs and among the proxy addresses, so that if it is an email assigned to me, it'd be listed on the proxy addresses, and it will be able to identify me that way. So this is the other way that you could solve this issue.
Thank you very
Does
much,
that-
Jeff.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to describe all the potential solution for this known issue, I would say.
No problem.
Okay.
And
Oh, sorry, Frank, we had more. Sorry.
no, go, please.
No, I was going to say if that was it, but I'm glad we're getting the question. So please.
Now, something maybe interesting as well, because from Microsoft documentation, it is mentioned about data plane for tenant restriction v2. Maybe it's something you can speak a little bit more about.
Yes, so this is in public preview today, and there are two options for the data plane protection. The first one was released, I think, a couple years ago, and it was Windows client-side header injection. Essentially, any application that is making requests via the WAM within the Windows device, we would be able to inject the header. Now, this was great because now I don't even have to proxy the network traffic at all. The device itself will do the header injection for me. But the main limitation was which applications actually support this native networking flow via the WAM to do the header injection. So Chrome didn't support it. Any kind of thick client app that is non-Microsoft probably doesn't support it. And so the only way that you'd actually get full coverage is to essentially allow list the applications on your device and say it has to be Edge and it has to be, Microsoft Outlook. It couldn't be this third-party application, because otherwise you'd get the header injection for some apps, but not on others. So it was very an incomplete solution, shall I say? Now this is in public preview still. And according to even in the public documentation, it says that I don't think the plans are for this to ever go generally available, because universal tenant restrictions is the better path. Now, everything I talked about with global secure access today, that is just the prerequisite of just deploying the clients. But once the clients are there, we'll tunnel all of the traffic regardless of which application is making the requests. So now we have brought this to any application for any device that we have a support for the client. Now the data plane protection, which was available in Windows and is now available through GSA in public preview, does essentially two things. Number one, it blocks anonymous access links. So if someone creates an anonymous link for a file or a folder in OneDrive or SharePoint, it would block that, meaning you have to be authenticated before we're going to let you access this. And the second had to do with preventing token infiltration, meaning if I'm able to copy and paste an access token from an unmanaged device to, let's say, a personal OneDrive, and then bring it onto a corporate device, and then try to play that access token directly to my own personal OneDrive or SharePoint or whatever it is, that there's some additional logic implemented on the app side to detect that token infiltration and essentially deny access. Now, all of that is in public preview. Just keep that in mind. But the authentication plane, so there's the data plane, which is me talking to the apps with access tokens. And there's the authentication plane, which is me talking to Entra ID to either use or get refresh tokens, or refresh, play the refresh token to get an access token. Everything on the authentication plane is generally available for universal tenant restrictions, and the data plane coverage is in public preview. So just want to make that distinction.
Thank you very much. We get another one from the Q&A session. Can Entra ID cross tenant synchronization be used for GAL sync between two tenants? And second part of the question, will it remain the correct email address while preventing the display name showing ext dash something? So this is a bit not exactly on top of the topic, but I think it's interesting maybe if we...
I am by no means an expert on Exchange, but I'll do my best.
I can help maybe as well.
There is something called Cross Tenant Synchronization, which I would not recommend for just standard Cross Tenant collaboration. Cross Tenant Sync is more for organizations who have a tight-knit relationship between them. So again, think the Microsoft and the LinkedIn. It's two companies, but sort of owned by the same umbrella organization. And what you can do is essentially synchronize users automatically as B2B members. You could set the user type as guest or member, but most of the time you'd set them as member in this type of relationship. And as part of that, you can also map additional attributes to automatically be populated on the B2B object type. One of those attributes is the guest object mail enabled, true or false? If you set this to true, it should show up in the gal. Now you want to be aware that within the gal there can be conflicts with the existing contact objects that you may have provisioned. So if that is the case, I think the setting of the mail enabled to true will fail until you delete the conflict contact object. And Frank, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add.
Yeah, so it's not similar to the gal sync. It's a tools that allow you to provision user to another tenant to be able to use as the schema that mentioned by Jeff, which is the home tenant and the resource tenant. So you provision to the resource tenant your user. Now I will encourage you to search on the internet about Microsoft 365 multi-tenant organization. You will see that this is the first part of our multi-tenant organization strategy, and you will see that the GAL, for example, is really linked to Office 365 services that will use some attribute of this user that we synchronize using Cross Tenant Access to the tenant. So yes, I will encourage you to go to the internet and check for that if you want to know more. It's not really synchronizing the user is part of the Entra ID, I would say, but the way the services are using that to build the GAL is more Office 365 things. And I hope we at least help answer the question.
I think that was it. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you to Jeff for your presentation and for Frank for helping with the Q&A. We hope to see you next time. Have a great day. Bye.